Hello, welcome to our Wednesday interview. Today I'm really excited to announce our guest. Her name is Davona Blackhorse. She has her master's in clinical mental health counseling and she's working on her PhD in interdisciplinary health. Her research focus is on the psychological impact of toxic exposures related to uranium mining on the Native American lands and Indigenous ethical issues in science, engineering, and mathematics. In 2018, she received the Viola Award for Innovation in the Arts by the Flagstaff Arts Council and the Sustainability Leadership Awards for Northern Arizona University Environmental Caucus. I am excited to have her because she has a really awesome view on historical trauma and addiction. So welcome, Davona.
Hi, Marca. Thank you for having me. I'm going to introduce myself in Navajo first. Yaat Shidina Davona Blackhorse in She, Ashim Shlido, Tachini Bashin, Sitna Jenny A Dashichedo, Ashinha Dashinella, Equit Us, Sunshle, Ado She IC, Zetantade Nasha. Hi, my name is Davona Blackhorse. I am Salt Clan, born for the Red Streak running through the Water Clan, and I come from Big Mountain, Arizona. That's where my Nellie's family came from. And I'm in school right now on interdisciplinary health, like Marca said. And I'm just doing research. Right now, the research I'm focused on is the Indigenous ethical issues in STEM.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Davona, can you help our listeners understand a little bit about what is historical trauma and how that might relate to addiction?
Yes, historical trauma was defined by Maria Braveheart as the ongoing cumulative emotional and psychological wounding across generations, and that includes one's own lifespan. So this is, a lot of people tend to think this is something that happened just a long time ago, and they forget to consider, the ongoing impacts that are happening right now. But a lot of this stems from institutional oppression that Indigenous people have experienced, such as the form of violence where a higher social structure deprives another group of people from meeting their basic needs. And that happened with a lot of Indigenous tribes, where livestock was reduced, where cornfields were burned and things like that. And then there were fences put around people's homes so that people can become property owners, which leads to more, capitalistic type ideologies. But when that happens, a lot of people tend to internalize that oppression when believing that the things that are being negatively constructed about them, such as stereotypes or discrimination and the survivor's guilt and things like that, are true. Like, they start to believe those myths and misinformation, and that leads to all these other social ills, such as domestic violence. And domestic violence, if you've ever heard of Dr. Eduardo Duran, he talks about domestic violence in a way where it's a way for Indigenous people to release that internalized oppression on a safer target. And a lot of times they like to do that with somebody who looks similar to them. So it's almost like they're trying to erase that image of themselves because of all that internalized oppression and all that shame and all that, guilt, the survivor's guilt, which is like, I shouldn't be here, I don't matter. And these all have cumulative effects. And they're not really something that we see visually. It's just something that happens, this phenomenon that happens, socially. Yeah, and I feel like that's where a lot of the addictions happen, when people are suffering from addiction, because childhood trauma is when we talk about our children who are experiencing, their parents going through all these social issues. This also gets passed on to them, so they're exposed to trauma. And I think the boarding school had a huge effect in that part where they took an entire generation of children away from their families. So there's that language gap, there's that cultural gap, there's that parenting gap where they didn't quite get that good attachment to their parents. And in psychology, John Bowlby says that that secure attachment and bond between a mother and child is really important. But for these children, it's really important for their psychological and emotional well-being. So when these children are taken away, they're exposed to nothing but, abuse, sexual abuse, and watching, their other kids around them dying, then that really damages who they are, psychologically and emotionally. So they never really also learned those skills to be good parents when they came back. So they really did suffer with a lot of alcoholism and just different ways that were more maladaptive to deal with all this oppression and all this abuse that they experience.
Yeah, so historical trauma is not just something that happened back then, it's still happening now, and the effects of what happened back then are still very much present in the physiology of Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, and the biology, because when we think about there's like a study that was done on children in New Zealand about they did PET scans to see the development of their brain. So children who weren't exposed to abuse had a lot of activity there. They were firing and it was good, but the children who were abused, they didn't see very much activity in their brain in those areas. Like it was almost depleted at that point, and ACEs, I feel like is a really important scale only because it really determines, looks at the neurological developments, the disruption there. It looks at the social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, the adoption of health risk behaviors, and distress and early death. So it's huge. I mean, trauma kills people.
Yeah. Yeah, and the scale that you're referring to is the adverse childhood experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, something that I found interesting about what you were saying is that for the Native American community, child removal is a whole part of historical trauma.
Yeah.
So, there's this big repair that needs to happen where we don't continue to separate families, especially in the Native American community. And I also liked what you talked about with internalized oppression. And I'm wondering if treatment that doesn't utilize a strength-based approach might continue to contribute to internalized oppression with the different communities.
Yes, I feel like it really makes a big difference as far as validating people for what their experiences really are. Like if you think about how we measure psychological disorders, like if we use the MMPI is the personality exam, and that was based off of middle-class white men from Minnesota, and we're using those same testing tools on Indigenous people and people of color. So it doesn't take into consideration their spirituality or, the other things. In some places they could answer if they have experiences of spirituality or, healing, and they answer yes, they could put them on a scale of being schizophrenic, or having this paranoid personality disorder. And so I think it really matters as far as being able to address just historical trauma. Whitbeck, he has a scale that he created, and it recognizes historical trauma. It recognizes, complicated and prolonged grief when you're losing people all the time. It recognizes historical loss, such as, loss of your land, loss of, your livestock and things like that. So I think those kind of scales, if they were used more often, would be more it wouldn't make people feel like there's something wrong with them. You know, this is something that has happened to them, and that it can be changed, and that it can connect them back to their more social issues that relate to them, like uranium mining or, you know, coal mining around them, and they can get more involved and get more proactive in those things. But instead, it's almost like the blame of, you know, when someone's labeled with all these negative labels, it's like your responsibility. You guys got to fix yourselves, when a lot of the changes probably are more or less need to happen structurally, you know, and within healthcare systems and within mental health. And yeah, there's a lot.
Right. And then just to kind of close us out with this interview, another thing that you've mentioned before when we've talked is this idea of ecofeminism, and this idea of connecting to more than just ourselves and to each other, but to Earth as well. Can you give a little bit of insight into what that means and how treatment can be a little bit more comprehensive when it comes to treating addiction?
Yes, we come from a matrilineal society, and that has been completely disrupted by colonization, by heteropatriarchy. And our Navajo Nation and all governments, all tribal governments, have been constructed to put the men in charge, and to put them in charge of not just the government, but their women and also the land. And a lot of agendas, you know, for mining, for uranium and coal, and, you know, all these resources go through the government. So they're pushing their agendas through our government, through these men, and enfranchising them with funds, with money to, you know, to be successful in and just mining, you know, and moving people off their land. So I feel like that's a huge thing, and a lot of women have been disempowered in that way. A lot of women have lost their status. Like in Canada, if a woman marries a white man, she loses her status and things like that. So they put a lot of that under the control of the government and under the control of the men in our societies. So where it's not so matrilineal anymore.
Yeah. Lastly, what do you think would be the most important quality if we're going to work with families and addiction when it comes to keeping families together? What do Native American populations and Indigenous populations need as they kind of enter into addiction treatment?
I feel like some of the, like, my vision, you know, for some of this stuff really stems from using the land and revolving practices around more holistic healings that include, you know, more traditionalized practices, like bringing the culture back. And I feel like that's a way of decolonization, is to reconnect people back with the environment, because Indigenous people have that connection to the environment. It's always been a process of determination and a way of living. But now I feel like it's more linear, and people think more scientifically about science in a way that we're trying to figure things out. But in the Indigenous worldview, we're not, it's more about action based, you know, these are the things that we're going to do to show our reciprocal relationship with the environment, and also reteaching children and families and communities how to reconnect with the environment. And a lot of that will bring families together, like teach parenting styles with kinship, going back to the, you know, the original instructions that we were given, and reteaching those things. And I feel like the balance between the mind, the body, the spirit, and the context, the environment, is really important, because that's a lot of our traditional healing practices are a part of that structure of balance. It is healing in itself. So we already have the tools, to heal from all these things, but they're just not being used. They're being replaced, with westernized type of healing practices. And I feel like that's why a lot of times it doesn't work for Indigenous people.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you said that we already have the tools. Like the culture already has the tools. So there's a sense of kind of radical reclaiming of culture and ushering in a sense of belongingness.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. For our listeners, if you want to hear more from Davona, she was in a podcast episode with Beyond Flag podcast. And if you haven't heard of Beyond Flag, that's with Dr. Cody Bayless and Dr. Daniel Phillips. And they are two awesome psychologists in the community that are highlighting professionals in the community. So below, you'll have a link to that podcast and to their website if you want to hear more. So again, Davona, thank you so much for being here, and I really appreciate your insight on all of this stuff.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marca.
All right, bye.
Bye.